I received an email from my mother's lawyer. She's suing me for emotional distress because I didn't allow her in the delivery room for my second child. Amount of the lawsuit, $80. Suing in dollars. Grounds, grandparental alienation. The white envelope containing judicial notification arrived on an ordinary Monday morning as I was preparing breakfast for my 3-year-old son Gabriel, who was playing happily on the kitchen floor with colorful building blocks without imagining anything about the devastating legal storm that was about to explode in the life of our peaceful and functional family that I had carefully built during years of work as a human resources manager in a business consulting company, earning a comfortable salary that allowed me to provide a stable and secure life for my husband Eduardo and our little son, who represented everything that truly mattered in the world beyond professional abstractions and superficial social obligations that consumed so much time and energy without offering genuine emotional satisfaction, comparable to simply watching an innocent child discovering the wonders of the world through imaginative play. The mailman delivered that official envelope with the court stamp directly into my outstretched hands through the front door without any prior warning or mental preparation for the devastating content that I would discover upon nervously tearing the official seal revealing formal legal documents initiating a lawsuit filed by my own mother Regina against me for alleged moral damages in the absurd amount of 80,000 Rs based on a completely invented accusation that I had committed a non-existent crime called grandparental alienation by supposedly deliberately and maliciously preventing her contact with my son Gabriel during the birth of the second child that never happened because Gabriel was my only child, and there was absolutely no recent pregnancy or delivery from which my mother would have been unfairly excluded, justifying a lawsuit for devastating emotional damages. The absolute confusion that dominated my mind as I read and reread those official documents trying to understand how my own mother had reached the point of hiring a professional lawyer to sue her own daughter for a substantial financial amount based on a completely fictitious event that had never occurred in the objective reality shared by mentally healthy people, properly connected with verifiable facts, instead of permanently living in imaginary worlds populated by manufactured resentments and paranoid conspiracies about adult children supposedly maliciously conspiring to remove elderly parents from family relationships that they supposedly deserved by biological right, regardless of toxic behaviors that made close coexistence emotionally unsustainable for everyone involved, especially innocent children who should be protected from dysfunctional family dynamics instead of being instrumentalized as pawns in generational battles over control and power, rhetorically disguised as defense of legitimate rights of loving grandmothers, unfairly alienated by selfish and controlling daughters, unable to recognize the wisdom and fundamental rights of previous generations, who sacrificed everything to raise ungrateful children who now cruelly abandoned them in vulnerable old age. The innocent white envelope that I had casually held a few seconds earlier instantly transformed into a tangible symbol of a nightmare reality where basic family relationships had been completely replaced by formal judicial processes, mediated by professional lawyers charging substantial fees to translate complex personal resentments into technical legal language that transformed subjective emotional hurts into objective monetary claims, precisely quantified at 80,000 Rs, representing the supposed financial value of psychological suffering caused by exclusion from a delivery room that had never happened because there was no second child nor recent birth from which any person, including my mother, could have been reasonably excluded, justifying financial compensation for allegedly irreparable moral damages. The comforting noise of Gabriel innocently playing with colorful blocks on the kitchen floor painfully contrasted with the mental chaos that dominated my cognitive processing, trying simultaneously to understand possible motivations for such an absurd lawsuit based on a completely false factual premise, while also trying to immediately decide what would be the next practical steps to appropriately respond to a genuine legal threat, regardless of how ridiculous the underlying allegations were. Because courts sometimes validate seemingly absurd claims when victims of frivolous lawsuits don't adequately defend themselves through competent legal representation, capable of systematically demonstrating the falsity of accusations through objective evidence and credible testimonies refuting narratives fabricated by malicious or psychologically compromised litigants operating under the influence of persistent delusions, disconnected from shared consensus about factual reality. My first instinctive reaction was to simply immediately call my mother Regina, demanding explanations about motivations for such a bizarre lawsuit based on a completely fictitious event, but I quickly recognized that any direct communication could be maliciously interpreted or secretly recorded, for later use out of context as distorted evidence of supposedly aggressive or disrespectful behavior that would retrospectively validate Regina's narratives about a problematic daughter who justified protective judicial intervention. Of fundamental rights of a victimized grandmother systematically by elaborate family conspiracies aimed at cruelly distancing her from a loving relationship with an innocent grandson who supposedly desperately yearned for the constant presence of a maternal grandmother in his daily life, despite objective evidence demonstrating that Gabriel barely knew Regina due to geographic distance and mainly due to my conscious choices to limit his exposure to emotionally manipulative and psychologically toxic behaviors that characterize typical interactions with my mother during decades of dysfunctional maternal relationship that I had finally managed to establish on healthily distanced bases after years of individual therapy processing childhood traumas, and mainly developing appropriate boundaries protecting my own nuclear family from destructive influences of my family of origin. Eduardo arrived from work approximately 45 minutes after I had received that devastating judicial notification, still finding me sitting paralyzed at the kitchen table, holding official documents with visibly trembling hands, while Gabriel continued playing innocently, unaware of the legal storm that threatened to dramatically transform peaceful family dynamics into a formal judicial battlefield, where intimate personal relationships would be publicly dissected by professional strangers, coldly analyzing complex motivations and traumatic histories through reductionist lenses of legal precedents and formal statutes, inadequate to completely capture nuances of generational family dysfunctions perpetuating destructive patterns through decades of learned behaviors, and mainly through systematic refusals to acknowledge personal responsibilities for relational conflicts, consistently choosing to blame others instead of developing critical self-awareness about personal contributions to vicious cycles of resentment and retaliation, rhetorically disguised as justified defense of legitimate rights against imaginary aggressions perpetrated by non-existent family conspirators, maliciously operating behind the scenes to destroy fundamental relationships between generations that supposedly should naturally love each other unconditionally, simply for sharing biological ties, regardless of concrete behaviors, systematically demonstrating fundamental incompatibilities about essential values and mainly about basic conceptions of mutual respect and appropriate boundaries in healthy adult relationships. Eduardo was a dark-skinned 41-year-old man working as a mechanical engineer in the automotive industry, his black hair beginning to show increasing white strands at the temples, giving an appearance of premature maturity caused by stressful professional responsibilities, combined with constant pressures of modern family life trying to simultaneously balance demanding careers with present fatherhood and mainly with emotional support for a wife, frequently exhausted by conflicting demands of formal work and intensive maternal care for a small child requiring constant attention, characteristic of the 3-year developmental phase. When emerging independence paradoxically coexists with fundamental dependence on protective adults providing emotional security and predictable structures, organizing daily experiences into comforting routines, minimizing anxiety through reassuring familiarity. His brown eyes demonstrated that particular quality of constant concern, characteristic of people conscious about the fundamental fragilities of seemingly stable existences that can be suddenly destroyed by unpredictable events transforming peaceful lives into inescapable nightmares, where comfortable certainties are replaced by distressing uncertainties, requiring careful navigation through unknown territories, without reliable maps or experienced guides, offering clear directions about appropriate paths through complex crises, resisting simple solutions or quick resolutions, falsely promised by superficial consultants, selling illusions of control over fundamentally chaotic processes governed by unpredictable interactions between countless variables, including mainly the whims of psychologically unstable people, operating under the influence of irrational motivations, disconnected from logical considerations about predictable consequences of impulsive actions taken without adequate reflection on devastating impacts on fragile family relationships, critically depending on mutual trust, easily destroyed but hardly rebuilt after serious violations of basic expectations about minimally civilized behaviors between people supposedly connected by genuine affective bonds transcending superficial differences about trivial preferences. During the next hour, I meticulously reported to Eduardo the entire sequence of events from the arrival of the official envelope, to my shocked reading of the judicial documents revealing a lawsuit filed by Regina, claiming 80,000 reais in moral damages based on her exclusion from the delivery room of a non-existent second child, creating a completely false factual premise about an event that had never occurred in the objective reality shared by all mentally healthy people, properly connected with verifiable facts through hospital medical records, documenting that Gabriel was my only child born 3 years ago, without any subsequent pregnancy or additional birth, from which Regina could have been legitimately excluded, justifying legal claim for substantial financial compensation, repairing supposed irreparable emotional damages caused by deliberate and malicious alienation systematically perpetrated by a controlling daughter, actively conspiring to destroy the sacred relationship between a loving grandmother and innocent grandson, who supposedly suffered deeply from the absence of constant presence of an extended maternal figure, providing generational wisdom and especially unconditional love, characteristic of dedicated grandmothers generously investing time and emotional resources in the well-being of direct descendants, representing biological continuity and especially family legacy, transcending limitations of mortal individual lives through perpetuation of fundamental values and cultural traditions, carefully transmitted through successive generations, preserving collective identities against homogenizing forces of destructive modernity systematically, dissolving traditional family structures that historically provided social stability and especially existential meaning for isolated individuals, facing alone overwhelming challenges of precarious existences in a fundamentally hostile world, indifferent to personal sufferings of ordinary people, desperately struggling to simply survive with dignity through adverse circumstances beyond limited individual controls. Eduardo remained silent, processing shocked throughout my detailed narrative, his expression gradually changing from initial confusion to absolute disbelief, and finally to growing indignation, making jaw muscles visibly contract while he mentally considered the devastating implications of what I was meticulously describing through a superficially controlled voice, masking underlying panic about our family's uncertain future, suddenly confronting a genuine legal threat moved by a close relative apparently operating under the influence of persistent delusions, or perhaps simply under the guidance of a malicious attorney exploiting the emotional vulnerabilities of a lonely elderly client to generate substantial professional fees through frivolous litigation. Designed to extract financial settlements from victims intimidated by complex judicial processes, preferring to pay moderate amounts, avoiding the higher costs of prolonged legal defenses, even when underlying accusations are objectively false and easily refutable through simple documentary evidence such as birth certificates, unequivocally demonstrating that Gabriel was an only child with no subsequent siblings born after the initial birth 3 years ago, when Regina was present at the hospital, despite my initial preferences to limit immediate visitors in the delivery room, protecting the privacy and intimacy of a vulnerable moment, shared primarily with Eduardo as the consciously chosen marital partner, instead of with family of origin whose presences frequently generated unnecessary additional stresses during already sufficiently challenging experiences of complicated births, requiring total focus on intense physiological processes, instead of simultaneous navigation of complex emotional expectations of multiple family observers, bringing their own anxieties and personal agendas to professional medical spaces, organized primarily to maximize the safety and well-being of mothers and babies instead of to accommodate the desires of extended relatives, wanting to actively participate in experiences that reasonably belong more intimately to immediate parents, forming new nuclear family units progressively separated from families of origin. Through natural processes of adult individuation, establishing independent identities, and mainly consciously choosing with whom to share deeply personal, vulnerable moments, without automatic obligations to include all biologically connected people, regardless of the qualities of concrete relationships developed through years of interactions demonstrating fundamental compatibilities or incompatibilities about essential values and basic expectations about appropriate behaviors in intimate contexts, requiring mutual trust and mainly genuine respect for clearly communicated boundaries, about legitimate personal preferences deserving automatic honor instead of conflictual negotiations, treating individual decisions as personal offenses requiring elaborate justifications or emotional compensations, restoring wounded egos of people unable to accept the fundamental autonomy of independent adults making conscious choices about their own lives, without needing external approval from parental authorities whose powers legitimately end when children reach legal maturity, and mainly when they establish their own nuclear families deserving absolute priorities over residual loyalties. To families of origin that should ideally celebrate emerging independences, instead of resentfully resisting inevitable losses of central controls over adult lives of biological descendants who are not permanent properties of parents, but rather autonomous individuals deserving unconditional respect for personal decisions even when those decisions do not perfectly align with preferences or expectations of previous generations, frequently operating under the influence of obsolete cultural norms inadequate for contemporary realities characterized by increased geographical mobilities, and mainly by growing diversities of legitimate family structures transcending unique traditional models historically imposed through conformist social pressures, severely punishing deviations from arbitrarily defined, narrow normative patterns by temporary majorities exercising coercive powers over vulnerable minorities through formal and informal mechanisms of social control, perpetuating systemic injustices rhetorically masked as preservation of fundamental values or protection of natural orders supposedly established by unquestionable transcendent authorities, conveniently justifying privileges of dominant groups over subordinate groups through elaborate narratives, legitimizing structural inequalities based on superficial differences between human beings fundamentally equal in essential dignities, deserving universal recognition regardless of accidental characteristics, such as family origins, or especially conformity to arbitrary expectations about appropriate social roles determined by accidents of birth rather than by conscious choices reflecting authentic values, and especially by genuine commitments to collective well-being transcending narrow, selfish interests of isolated individuals seeking to maximize personal advantages through exploitation of others' vulnerabilities instead of through mutually beneficial cooperations, building just societies where everyone prospers simultaneously through equitable redistributions of resources and opportunities, guaranteeing basic dignities for all people regardless of inherited social positions, or especially regardless of individual capabilities to compete effectively in impersonal markets, systematically privileging some while marginalizing others through seemingly neutral but fundamentally biased mechanisms, favoring those who already possess initial advantages while progressively disadvantaging those who start without adequate resources to compete equitably in rigged systems, favoring established elites, protecting privileges through formal and informal barriers, preventing upward mobility of subordinated classes permanently kept in inferior positions through systematic denials of educational opportunities, and especially through perpetuation of ideological narratives naturalizing inequalities as inevitable results of meritocratic differences, rather than as products of historical injustices accumulated through successive generations of exploitation, and especially through structural violence conveniently made invisible by dominant discourses focusing exclusively on individual responsibilities, ignoring systemic contexts largely determining predictable outcomes of human lives, socially organized through institutions perpetuating established patterns, resisting fundamental changes threatening interests of beneficiaries of the status quo operating under illusions of meritocracy, while enjoying undeserved privileges based on luck of birth rather than on genuine efforts, or especially on significant contributions to collective well-being that should be the sole criterion for distribution of social rewards in truly just societies democratically organized with equal participation of all members in decision, making processes collectively affecting shared lives through fundamental interdependencies connecting individual destinies to collective destinies of human communities facing together common challenges of finite existences on a fragile planet, with limited resources requiring responsible cooperations instead of destructive competitions, unsustainably depleting material bases of dignified human lives for present generations, and especially for future generations, who will inherit consequences of contemporary choices about social organizations, and especially about relationships with non-human nature providing basic conditions for possible human existences critically depending on preservation of complex ecosystems easily destroyed but hardly restored after irreversible disturbances, caused by irresponsible human activities prioritizing immediate profits over long-term sustainability essential for collective survival, transcending particular interests of individuals or corporations, maximizing private gains while externalizing environmental and social costs to vulnerable communities and especially to future generations who do not participate in present negotiations, but will disproportionately suffer consequences of decisions made today without adequate considerations about lasting impacts on inevitably shared futures. Juliana was still processing the initial shock of that absurd lawsuit when her younger brother Marcos called that same afternoon, already showing he had been informed by Regina about the legal action filed against his older sister for allegedly having committed grandparental alienation by excluding the mother from the delivery room of a non-existent second child, creating a bizarre situation where Gabriel, the only 3-year-old son, had been mysteriously transformed through legal magic into a second child, preceded by a phantom older brother never born in objective reality, but apparently fully existing in the alternative universe inhabited by Regina, where paranoid narratives about elaborate family conspiracies completely replaced factual perceptions about events verifiable through simple documentary evidence, such as hospital records or mainly basic memories of close relatives, directly witnessing real events instead of imagining fictional events convenient to sustain previous resentments, desperately seeking retroactive justifications, legitimizing negative emotions already established before identifying specific causes supposedly generating those feelings through inverted processes where conclusions precede evidence instead of logically following careful analyses of objective facts systematically collected through honest investigations of complex realities, resisting convenient simplifications, reducing important nuances to false dichotomies between innocent victims and malicious villains operating in imaginary worlds, populated by one-dimensional characters instead of complex human beings simultaneously mixing admirable qualities and significant flaws through multifaceted personalities progressively developed through accumulated experiences shaping characters through continuous interactions between innate predispositions and especially environmental influences, including formative relationships during vulnerable childhoods, largely determining relational patterns perpetuated later through adult lives, unconsciously reproducing dynamics learned during critical developmental periods, when plastic brains rapidly absorb information, forming lasting neural connections, organizing cognitive processing and especially emotional regulation through psychological structures, established early resisting later changes even when installed patterns clearly prove dysfunctional, causing persistent suffering for the individuals themselves and especially for people intimately relating to carriers of unprocessed trauma, manifesting through destructive behaviors, perpetuating vicious cycles of emotional wounds, transmitted generationally through inadequate parenting, unconsciously, reproducing abuses experienced during their own childhoods by parents equally traumatized by previous generations, creating transgenerational chains of accumulated suffering through decades or centuries of family dysfunctions, never adequately addressed through appropriate therapeutic interventions, interrupting perpetuation of destructive patterns through development of critical awareness about origins of problematic behaviors, and especially through deliberate cultivation of healthy alternatives based on valid psychological principles about fundamental human needs, including especially needs for secure emotional connections, providing stable bases for confident explorations of external worlds, and mainly for development of integrated autonomous identities capable of mature relationships characterized by healthy interdependencies, appropriately balancing individual autonomies with relational intimacies instead of pathologically oscillating between suffocating fusions and defensive distancing, avoiding vulnerabilities inherent to genuine connections, requiring authentic openness, risking painful rejections, but also enabling deeply satisfying experiences of being truly seen and genuinely accepted by significant others, validating existences through mutual recognition, establishing shared humanities, transcending fundamental existential isolation of subjective consciousnesses, perpetually imprisoned within unique individual perspectives directly inaccessible to other minds, operating in parallel, but separately through simultaneous but distinct lives, only superficially sharing external realities while inhabiting radically different inner worlds, organized through unique personal histories and especially through idiosyncratic attributed meanings to objectively similar experiences but subjectively processed differently through interpretive lenses shaped by particular biographical contexts, including especially traumatic experiences permanently, marking psyches through lasting impressions, organizing subsequent perceptions through defensively developed filters, protecting against repetitions of original wounds through anxious anticipations of potential threats hypersensitively detected in current environments based on patterns established during past traumas, creating self-fulfilling prophecies where negative expectations generate defensive behaviors, provoking exactly the feared reactions from others, apparently confirming validities of paranoid beliefs about universal hostilities instead of revealing socially constructed natures of interpersonal realities. Dynamically emerging through reciprocal interactions between participants, actively constructing relationships through mutually influenced behavioral choices in circular processes where causes and effects become indistinguishable through feedback loops, progressively complexifying simple relational systems into complicated dynamics, resisting simplified linear analyses, seeking identifications of single culprits, responsible for collective problems organically emerging through multiple contributions from all involved, actively but often unconsciously participating in co-creations of dysfunctional patterns, perpetuated through systematic failures to recognize shared responsibilities for maintenance of vicious cycles that everyone claims to suffer from, but few admit to perpetuating through their own reactive behaviors to equally reactive behaviors of others, creating downward spirals where everyone progressively loses through competitive escalations of mutual retaliations, retrospectively justified as legitimate defenses against initial aggressions always conveniently attributed to others, while own hostile. Contributions are rationalized as appropriate responses to previous provocations, selectively ignoring how own behaviors provoked reactions that are now interpreted as unprovoked attacks, justifying counterattacks in the name of restorative justice, when in fact they simply perpetuate cyclical vengeance where nobody finally wins, but everyone cumulatively loses, through progressive destructions of potentially valuable relationships, unnecessarily sacrificed on altars of wounded pride, refusing to admit vulnerabilities, or mainly refusing to offer genuine forgiveness. Liberating both forgivers and forgiven from emotional prisons of corrosive resentments, consuming vital energies that could be productively invested in building better futures, instead of obsessive rumination on immutable past injustices, regardless of how many efforts are wasted trying to rewrite histories through retrospective revisionism seeking late validations of particular perspectives on ambiguous events, admitting multiple legitimate interpretations, depending on adopted points of view, and mainly depending on interests at stake, motivating biased selections of favorable evidence, systematically ignoring uncomfortable contradictory information for preferred narratives, satisfying psychological needs for coherence, even at the cost of significant distortions of complex truths resisting convenient but deceptive simplifications, transforming nuanced realities into simplified stories with clearly identifiable good guys and bad guys, instead of honestly recognizing moral ambiguities inherent to complicated situations where imperfect people make difficult decisions in challenging circumstances without complete information, or mainly without adequate time for careful deliberations ideally desirable but practically impossible in contexts of urgent pressures demanding immediate actions based on intuitive judgments developed through previous experiences that may or may not be appropriately applicable to present situations sufficiently similar or perhaps sufficiently different to invalidate previously learned lessons, creating dilemmas about when to trust tested intuitions, and mainly about when to question established heuristics, potentially inadequate for new challenges requiring innovative approaches, transcending conventional wisdoms based on past successes that perhaps will not repeat in futures, transformed by accelerated changes in environmental, technological, social, cultural, economic, political conditions demanding continuous adaptations of strategies and mainly demanding cognitive flexibilities, avoiding mental rigidity, imprisoning people in obsolete, thoses perpetuated inertially through psychological resistances to changes temporarily destabilizing established identities, forcing painful recognitions of personal evolution needs through humble learning, admitting limitations of previous knowledge, and especially admitting possibilities of honest mistakes committed despite genuine intentions to act correctly according to understandings available at decision, making moments when choices were made based on incomplete but reasonable information given particular contexts that retrospectively prove inadequate but prospectively seemed rationally justified, according to criteria widely accepted by relevant communities, sharing fundamental values about ethical principles, guiding responsible conduct in pluralistic societies, tolerating diversities of legitimate perspectives, coexisting peacefully through mutual respect for non-essential differences while simultaneously preserving shared commitments to central universal values, transcending cultural particularities such as fundamental human dignities, deserving absolute protections against violations regardless of justifications offered by perpetrators, conveniently rationalizing abuses as necessary for higher purposes, or primarily as appropriate responses to perceived threats, often paranoically exaggerated through systematic amplifications of real risks transformed into imaginary terrors, justifying extreme measures disproportionate to objective dangers rationally assessed by neutral observers, not emotionally invested in particular conflicts, distorting perceptions of direct participants interpreting ambiguities automatically in the most threatening ways possible through confirmatory biases, selectively seeking evidence validating pre-existing beliefs, while systematically ignoring contradictory information, challenging comfortably established narratives, even when objectively these narratives prove increasingly unsustainable in the face of accumulating Contrary evidence eventually forcing painful revisions of fundamental understandings about realities, or primarily about own identities, constructed partially on central beliefs suddenly revealed as persistent illusions, defensively maintained, protecting fragile egos against recognitions of frightening vulnerabilities about fundamental existential contingencies where illusory controls over personal destinies dissolve, revealing deep dependencies on random external factors largely determining trajectories of human lives, pretending autonomies through heroic narratives about self. Determinations. When honestly, most biographical outcomes primarily reflect birth luck, and mainly unpredictable sequences of fortuitous events beyond any possible individual control, despite comforting illusions about personal agencies actively shaping futures through conscious choices when really most navigate blindly through improvised existences, reacting to externally imposed circumstances rather than proactively directing life courses, according to carefully elaborated plans, in moments of calm reflection that rarely occur in chaotic realities of frantic daily lives, consuming energies and endless urgencies, leaving little time or primarily little mental energy for philosophical contemplations about ultimate meanings or transcendent purposes of seemingly absurd existences when honestly examined without recourse to religious or ideological consolations, offering artificially manufactured meanings through grandiose narratives about cosmic destinies or historical missions, conveniently masking fundamental insignificances of individual lives on universal scales, where entire humanity represents merely infinitesimal point in spatial and temporal immensity of indifferent cosmos operating mechanically, according to blind physical laws without purposes or intentions, anthropomorphically attributable by human minds, desperately seeking meanings in fundamentally meaningless universe beyond those creatively invented by consciousnesses, accidentally emerged through blind evolutionary processes, randomly selecting genetic variations based exclusively on immediate reproductive advantages, without any teleological direction toward predetermined ends or primarily toward imaginary perfections that never existed except in utopian fantasies of idealistic philosophers, disconnected from brutal material realities of biological existences, violently competing for scarce resources in hostile environments through Darwinian struggles for ending genetic arms races where advantageous adaptations today become obsolete tomorrow. When environmental conditions change unpredictably, and especially when competitors develop counter survival, where only the fit reproduce by transmitting victorious genes to subsequent generations, perpetuating successful lineages, while countless others become permanently extinct, leaving no traces in evolutionary records, documenting only temporary winners in never adaptations, neutralizing previous advantages through perpetual coevolutions, where everyone runs frantically just to maintain the same relative positions without absolute progress toward non-existent final goals. Because evolution has no direction or purpose beyond the blind perpetuation of genetic replicators using organisms as disposable vehicles serving the interests of selfish genes, maximizing their own propagation through generations, without any consideration for the welfare of individual carriers routinely sacrificed when it suits genetic strategies, maximizing representations in future generations regardless of cost to particular individuals living miserably, but reproducing prolifically, transmitting genes to numerous descendants who will repeat cycles of suffering through existences devoted primarily to continuous reproductions of the same genetic patterns eternally without cumulative learning or moral progress, transcending blind biological imperatives through cultural evolutions, progressively liberating humans from genetic determinism through the development of rationality, allowing conscious choices occasionally contradicting immediate genetic interests in favor of superior ethical values culturally invented through civilizations, painfully building through millennia social norms, restricting naturally evolved selfish behaviors that are evolutionarily favored but socially destructive when universally generalized without moral restrictions externally imposed through collective sanctions, punishing violations of ethical codes conventionally established through laboriously negotiated consensus between human groups coexisting in proximity, requiring minimal cooperation for collective survival, transcending individualistic competitions, maximizing personal gains regardless of social costs, conveniently externalized onto others, or especially onto future generations, inheriting liabilities accumulated by present generations, unsustainably consuming limited resources without adequate consideration of intergenerational justice equitably, distributing opportunities through time instead of concentrating privileges exclusively on contemporaries, selfishly depleting common inheritances, legitimately belonging also to future descendants, equally deserving access to natural resources, enabling dignified existences comparable to standards currently enjoyed by privileged minorities, while global majorities survive miserably in absolute poverty, partially caused by deeply unequal distributions of collectively generated wealth but privately appropriated by elites controlling means of production through economic systems, systematically favoring owners over workers actually producing value through labor, but receiving only fractions of created wealth, while surpluses are captured by capitalists contributing minimally beyond providing previously accumulated capital through systematic exploitation ideologically justified as deserved rewards for assuming entrepreneurial risks, when frequently these risks are minimized through socialization of potential losses, while profits are asymmetrically privatized favoring investors at the expense of taxpayers, indirectly subsidizing corporations through generous tax exemptions and especially through government bailouts, guaranteeing privatization of profits, but socialization of losses in fundamentally unjust arrangements, perpetuating inequalities through generations transforming nominal democracies into de facto plutocracies, where wealth buys political influence through campaign financing and especially through lobbying. My professional life has always been methodically structured through predictable routines, characteristic of a human resources manager working at a medium-sized business consulting firm located in the busy commercial center of the city, where I daily negotiated complex organizational conflicts involving dissatisfied employees and primarily mediated disputes about corporate benefits through rationally established policies based on clear and predictable legal precedents that offered the reassuring security of objective solutions for problems frequently subjective and emotionally charged. The devastating irony of being extremely professionally competent in resolving corporate interpersonal conflicts, but completely unprepared to navigate personal catastrophe involving my own mother suing me for moral damages based on a completely fictitious event did not go unnoticed during those first paralyzing hours after receiving official judicial notification, transforming an already distant but functionally civilized maternal relationship into a formal legal battle mediated by professional lawyers, translating complex emotional resentments into precise monetary claims that somehow quantified alleged psychological suffering at exactly 80,000 Rs. The relationship with my mother, Regina, during years prior to Gabriel's birth had been characterized by convenient geographical distance, providing necessary emotional space to establish independent adult identity, separate from family of origin through gradual process of individuation, that some psychologists consider fundamental for healthy development of mature autonomy, instead of remaining in infantilized dependence on parental authorities whose powers legitimately diminish. When children reach legal maturity establishing their own nuclear families, deserving absolute priorities over residual loyalties to previous generations that ideally should celebrate emerging independences, instead of resentfully resisting inevitable losses of central controls over adult lives of biological descendants who are not permanent properties of parents. Regina always demonstrated that particular combination of superficial charm and subtle manipulation that characterizes narcissistic personalities operating strategically to maximize attention received, while minimizing responsibilities assumed for negative consequences of selfish choices, consistently prioritizing own needs over well-being of close people who should theoretically matter more than narrow individualistic interests, exclusively focused on immediate satisfaction of personal desires regardless of costs conveniently externalized onto others, absorbing impacts of decisions made unilaterally without appropriate consultations, or mainly without genuine considerations of alternative perspectives, that could reveal problematic aspects of plans elaborated in isolation within egocentric bubbles, impermeable to external critical feedback, challenging fundamental assumptions. The decision to drastically limit contact with Regina after Gabriel's birth was not taken lightly, but rather after years of individual therapy processing childhood traumas, and mainly developing critical understanding about dysfunctional patterns perpetuated through generations in my family of origin, where emotional manipulations were normalized as legitimate expressions of love instead of being recognized as subtle forms of psychological abuse, causing lasting damage even when executed by people claiming best intentions, but unable or mainly unwilling to recognize how their behaviors negatively affected emotional well-being of children who deserve protection instead of instrumentalization as narcissistic extensions serving egocentric needs of parents, incapable of genuinely loving beyond idealized projections. My therapist, Dr. Fernanda, during weekly sessions over 3 years, had patiently helped deconstruct internalized narratives about filial guilt, where I automatically assumed responsibility for Regina's maternal dissatisfactions, attributing imaginary failures of mine instead of recognizing that adults are fundamentally responsible for their own emotions and mainly for choices about how to respond to inevitable frustrations of imperfect lives, where not all expectations can be realistically satisfied, especially when these expectations are fundamentally unrealistic, based on fantasies about total control over destinies of other people who possess legitimate autonomies to make choices diverging from others' preferences, without need for elaborate justifications or emotional compensations restoring wounded egos. The gradual therapeutic process of establishing appropriate boundaries with Regina had been emotionally exhausting but absolutely necessary to protect my own mental health, and primarily to break transgenerational cycles of family dysfunction that I was determined not to perpetuate with Gabriel through unconscious repetitions of patterns learned during my own childhood, where legitimate emotional needs were systematically invalidated or completely ignored, while unrealistic expectations about performances were rigidly imposed through conditional approvals punitively withdrawn whenever behaviors minimally deviated from narrow scripts arbitrarily defined by parental authorities operating under illusions of omniscience about what would be best for children, without any genuine consideration for perspectives or preferences of those whose lives were being coercively directed. Gabriel was growing up in an environment radically different from the one I had experienced during my own childhood, characterized by emotional instability, and mainly by unpredictability, about which version of Regina I would find when returning from school each afternoon, ranging from effusive charm when she was in a good mood to devastating criticisms when her professional or personal frustrations needed to be discharged, on convenient targets who couldn't effectively retaliate due to fundamental dependencies of children on parents who control material resources and especially emotional approvals, essential for healthy development of positive self. Esteem allowing confident navigation through complex social challenges faced during childhood, and especially during adolescence, when identities are being actively constructed through experimentation with different social roles and relational styles. Eduardo came from a completely different family characterized by genuine affection, expressed openly instead of subtle manipulations, disguised as legitimate maternal concerns, and primarily by direct communications about expectations, instead of psychological games, where contradictory messages created deliberate confusion, keeping children permanently off balance trying to decipher what was really expected of them through ambiguous signals interpreted differently depending on unpredictable parental moods, transforming childhoods into constant exercises of exhausting mind. Reading instead of protected periods for carefree play and creative explorations that should characterize those precious years of rapid cognitive development and especially of establishing lasting relational patterns based on concrete experiences with primary caregivers demonstrating through consistent actions instead of just through empty words. The fundamental difference between our families of origin became especially evident during rare extended family visits, where Regina's behaviors contrasted dramatically with the behaviors of Eduardo's parents, who treated Gabriel with genuine affection, without hidden agendas or impossible expectations about performances that a 3-year-old child should obviously be incapable of satisfying, but which Regina rigidly imposed through veiled criticisms about my parental choices, always rhetorically framed as concerns about Gabriel's well-being, but transparently motivated by her needs to control all aspects of the lives of close people, keeping them dependent on her approvals, instead of allowing development of healthy autonomies characteristic of mature adults capable of making independent choices without the need for constant external validations from authorities who should have relinquished power when children reached legal maturity. During the last 2 years before the white envelope arrived on that fateful Monday morning, completely transforming the trajectory of our peaceful family lives through the introduction of a formal legal system in an already tense but functionally manageable maternal relationship through carefully cultivated geographic and especially emotional distancing. Contacts with Regina had been strategically limited to brief monthly phone calls and supervised quarterly in-person visits where Eduardo was always present, providing an objective witness for potentially problematic interactions and mainly offering immediate emotional support when Regina's manipulations began affecting my laboriously constructed psychological balance through years of therapy processing childhood traumas that she had caused through systematic emotional neglect, disguised as rigorous educational methods aimed at producing successful children instead of emotionally healthy ones. Marcos maintained even more limited contact with Regina, visiting only during major holidays when social obligations made his absence socially embarrassing for her, in front of extended relatives who completely lacked knowledge of the dysfunctional dynamics operating invisibly beneath the surface of an apparently normal family, publicly presented through carefully rehearsed performances during social events, where everyone pretended harmonies non-existent in private contexts characterized by resentments. Accumulated through decades of emotional wounds not adequately processed, because the family of origin valued maintenance of social appearances over honest resolutions of underlying conflicts through difficult conversations that would require authentic vulnerabilities instead of habitual defensiveness protecting fragile egos against painful recognitions of shared responsibilities for relational dysfunctions perpetuated through behavioral choices of all participants, instead of simply clearly identifiable innocent victims and malicious villains. The judicial notification represented a dramatic and unexpected escalation of manageable family conflict into a formal legal battle that would inevitably create permanent and irreparable divisions, not only between Regina and me, but mainly throughout the extended family who would be forced to choose sides during public litigation, exposing privately dynamics that we had all implicitly collaborated in keeping hidden from external observers through complicit silences about problematic behaviors that everyone witnessed, but nobody openly challenged because direct confrontations were rigorously enforced. Family cultural taboos through subtle social sanctions, punishing members who violated unwritten rules about absolute family loyalties, transcending considerations about justice or objective truth, when these conflicted with imperatives of protecting collective reputations against external scrutiny, threatening to reveal carefully hidden imperfections. Eduardo worked in the automobile industry located in an industrial district approximately 40 minutes by car from our residence in a quiet residential neighborhood, characterized by tree-lined streets and mainly by a general sense of community safety, where children played freely on sidewalks, casually supervised by neighbors we knew nominally through cordial greetings exchanged during morning walks with Gabriel, or during casual encounters at the local supermarket where we did weekly shopping, following a methodically organized list by product categories, minimizing time needed to complete a routine but essential domestic task for maintaining a functional home, providing adequate nutrition, and mainly a clean and organized environment, contributing to the psychological sense of control over basic aspects of daily existence in a frequently chaotic and unpredictable world. His professional routine involved morning departures at 7 o'clock, preceded by a quick breakfast, usually consisting of toast with black coffee that he preferred without sugar, claiming that bitter taste helped wake up completely, preparing the mind for complex technical challenges waiting at the office where he supervised a team of 5 junior engineers working on automotive design projects involving precise calculations about material resistance and mainly about energy efficiency optimizations through structural weight reductions without compromising operational safety, which was always absolute priority, transcending considerations about production costs or delivery deadlines when these conflicted with quality standards rigorously maintained through multiple design reviews before final approvals, authorizing prototype fabrications tested exhaustively. He usually returned at 18 hours, often mentally exhausted by intense concentration required during long working days, but professionally satisfied when he managed to solve particularly challenging technical problems through creative solutions that demonstrated expertise accumulated through 15 years of experience in a specialized field, where practical knowledge acquired through trial and error perfectly complemented formal theoretical training obtained during mechanical engineering graduation. Completed with academic distinctions that had initially attracted recruiters from the company where he currently worked, after having systematically progressed through the corporate hierarchy, from the initial position as junior engineer to the current position of project manager supervising multiple teams coordinated through weekly meetings, aligning individual efforts with larger organizational objectives, defined by senior executives strategically planning corporate futures. Gabriel spent weekdays in a high-quality daycare conveniently located between our residence and my workplace, allowing me to drop him off during the morning commute to the office, and mainly pick him up during the evening return, without significant detours that would consume precious time that I preferred to dedicate to family interactions, instead of navigating through congested urban traffic, characteristic of the big city where we had lived since before Gabriel was born, when we had consciously chosen that specific neighborhood based on proximity to well-rated daycares and mainly to excellent primary schools that Gabriel would attend in subsequent years when he reached the appropriate age for transition from the predominantly recreational environment of daycare to the more structured and educationally focused environment of formal school. The daycare was called Espacio Crecher and was operated by experienced educators specialized in early child development, who implemented a balanced curriculum combining free play with structured activities designed to stimulate cognitive development through age appropriate educational games, and mainly through supervised social interactions where children learned essential skills of sharing, cooperation, and mainly emotional regulation through gentle mediations when inevitable conflicts emerged during group play where multiple individual wills needed to be negotiated through mutual compromises instead of through unilateral impositions of stronger wills over weaker wills, as would happen without appropriate adult supervision teaching prosocial values through concrete examples and mainly through consistent consequences. The educators regularly reported during quarterly parent meetings that Gabriel demonstrated completely normal and mainly healthy development through milestones reached punctually according to expected schedules for his age, including increasingly sophisticated expressive language, allowing clear communications about needs and preferences, instead of dependencies on non-verbal communications such as crying or tantrums characteristic of earlier developmental stages that he had happily overcome through natural neurological maturation, and mainly through responsive environments that consistently validated his communicative attempts, positively reinforcing efforts to express himself verbally instead of behaviorally through disruptive actions. My own professional routine as a human resources manager involved varied responsibilities, including recruitment of new employees through structured selection processes, designed to identify candidates who not only possessed necessary technical qualifications but primarily demonstrated cultural compatibility with organizational values that the company prioritized through formal mission statements, and mainly through concrete practices, rewarding collaborative behaviors instead of destructive competition between colleagues that could maximize individual performances but inevitably harmed collective performances through erosion of mutual trust, essential for effective coordination of group efforts directed at shared objectives transcending narrow individualistic interests. Additionally, I managed mediations of interpersonal conflicts between employees that inevitably emerged in work environments where people from diverse backgrounds with varied personalities were forced to interact closely during prolonged hours daily, creating occasional frictions that needed to be proactively addressed before escalating into serious disputes harming productivities and mainly poisoning organizational atmospheres through accumulated resentments that spread virally through informal social networks connecting employees beyond formal hierarchical structures officially recognized in simplified corporate organizational charts that only partially captured the complexities of real relationships, operating dynamically through daily interactions, shaping organizational cultures through emergent norms instead of through formal policies imposed from the top down. Ironically, my recognized professional competence in navigating complex organizational conflicts through skillful mediations, balancing interests of multiple parties, while staying focused on the collective well-being of the organization contrasted dramatically with my apparent inability to predict or prevent the family catastrophe that had exploded that Monday morning through an official judicial notification, transforming an already problematic but functionally manageable maternal relationship into a formal legal battle that would require navigation through completely unknown territories where intuitions developed through decades of personal experiences would be inadequate for technical legal challenges, requiring specialized expertise from professional lawyers translating emotional conflicts into formal legal languages that I only vaguely understood through casual exposures in movies or news. The paralyzing sensation of fundamental incompetence in a domain so central to my identity as a daughter, and mainly as a responsible adult capable of managing complex interpersonal relationships, was deeply destabilizing to a laboriously constructed self-concept through consistent professional successes, validating competencies in areas that I had chosen to dedicate energies during a 15-year career in human resources where I had systematically progressed from an initial position as an administrative assistant to the current position of manager, supervising an entire department with 6 employees, directly reporting to me, and mainly assuming strategic responsibilities for organizational policies affecting hundreds of employees through decisions that I actively participated in formulating during monthly executive meetings where different departments coordinated integrated planning, aligning partial objectives with larger corporate visions, articulated by a CEO whom we all deeply respected. The white envelope remained on the kitchen table where I had left it, after the initial shocked reading revealing impossible contents that my mind struggled to process rationally, trying to reconcile. The objective reality of a formal judicial notification in my hands, with the complete absurdity of underlying allegations about grandparental alienation related to the birth of a second child that had never happened because Gabriel was an only child without previous or subsequent siblings who could have been the object of maternal exclusions during hospital births that Regina falsely claimed to have experienced, justifying lawsuits for moral damages precisely quantified at 80,000 Rs, representing the supposed financial value of psychological suffering caused by deliberate exclusions from emotionally significant moments that grandparents deserved to witness according to some distorted logic that I could not understand. The final sentence came 6 months later in a brown envelope that I received personally at Dr. Henrique's office during a rainy Thursday afternoon, when heavy drops rhythmically hit against the panoramic windows of the 12th floor, offering a melancholic view over the foggy city that seemed to perfectly reflect the emotional turbulences that had completely dominated the last months of my existence, transforming previously predictable routines into endless sequences of anxieties about legal outcomes that would fundamentally determine not only financial issues related to hypothetical compensation payments, but mainly future relational structures, defining possibilities of reconciliations or confirming definitive ruptures with the mother who, despite all dysfunctionalities exhaustively documented during the judicial process, remained the only mother I would have regardless of her characteristic imperfections that individual. Therapy, which I had started 3 months ago, was gradually helping me to contextualize within broader transgenerational family histories involving unprocessed traumas unconsciously transmitted through successive generations of women who never had opportunities or resources. To question dysfunctional patterns automatically inherited as if they were natural instead of socially constructed through specific historical conditions that could have been different under alternative circumstances, facilitating developments of healthier maternal relationships based on mutual respect and mainly on recognitions of adult daughters' autonomies who deserve to live their own lives without manipulative interferences disguised as maternal concerns justifying invasions of privacies that violated basic boundaries that functional. Adults established protecting personal spaces against emotional intrusions from family members who confused intimacy with entanglements that prevented healthy individuations necessary for psychological maturities, allowing interdependent instead of codependent relationships, characterized by identity fusions that were suffocating for people who valued autonomies without meaning rejections of connections that remained important but needed to be reconfigured, respecting needs for distances that allowed freely chosen approaches instead of imposed through guilt or obligations that were emotional weapons used by manipulative parents controlling adult children through emotional blackmail that exploited family loyalties that everyone internalized during socializations in cultures that prioritized collectivities over individualities, creating tensions between desires for independence and needs for approvals from parental figures whose opinions maintained disproportional significance, even when adult children rationally recognized that parental approvals should not be conditions for self-worth that needed to be internally derived instead of externally dependent on validations from other people, including parents, who were often the last people capable of providing genuine validations because excessive emotional investments in children's performances transformed relationships into competitive battlefields instead of sources of unconditional support that characterized healthy parenthood, distinguishing these from narcissistic parenthood where children existed primarily to satisfy parents' emotional needs instead of the reverse, which was appropriate recognizing fundamental asymmetries of parental relationships where adults had responsibilities to care for children who did not choose to be born and who were completely dependent on parental care during formative years that largely determined future psychological developments through qualities of attachment that children formed with primary caregivers who were generally mothers in traditional cultures, but could be any consistently responsive adults to infant needs, validating emotional experiences through empathic attunements that were foundations of emotional security, allowing confident explorations of worlds based on knowledge that secure bases were available when necessary, providing comfort during inevitable distresses that children experienced discovering their own limitations, and mainly discovering that not all desires could be immediately satisfied because realities imposed frustrating restrictions that children needed to learn to tolerate, developing capacities for delayed gratifications that were essential for adaptive functioning in societies where cooperations sometimes required sacrifices of immediate interest for long-term collective benefits that justified individual costs of short-term through expected reciprocities that would eventually compensate initial sacrifices when others reciprocated cooperations in future moments when positions would be reversed and previous cooperators would become beneficiaries of cooperations from people they had helped before establishing mutual relationships based on trust built through histories of positive interactions accumulated over time demonstrating reliabilities that were valuable in communities where reputations influenced access to resources, and especially to collaborations that multiplied individual capabilities through coordinations allowing achievements of objectives that would be impossible in isolation, but that became feasible when efforts were combined through divisions of labor that optimized efficiencies through specializations, allowing people to focus on activities where they possessed comparative advantages instead of trying to be self-sufficient in all areas, which would be impossible given limitations of time and capabilities that were distributed unequally across populations that were heterogeneous in talents and interests, that were shaped partially by genetics but mainly by environments that offered differential opportunities for skill development. Through exposures to activities and especially through encouragements from adults who validated efforts, incentivizing persistence through initial failures that were inevitable during learning of complex skills requiring deliberate practice for thousands of hours before masteries could be achieved. Allowing performances that seemed effortless to observers, who did not appreciate the amounts of invisible work that had been necessary to reach levels of competence that made executions seem natural when they were actually products of extensive training that had automated sequences of actions through repetitions that transferred controls from deliberative cognitive systems that were slow and required conscious efforts to procedural systems that operated automatically without conscious attention, freeing cognitive resources for more complex aspects of performances that required creative improvisations, adapting responses to particular circumstances that varied unpredictably, preventing exclusive dependencies on memorized routines that were inadequate when situations deviated from expected patterns, requiring cognitive flexibilities that allowed quick adjustments through evaluations of contexts that informed selections of appropriate responses from repertoires of available options that had been learned through varied experiences in diverse contexts that provided generalizable knowledge bases that could be adaptively applied in new situations that shared relevant characteristics with familiar situations, allowing transfers of learning that were essential for cognitive efficiencies, because learning anew solutions for each problem would be impossible given limitations of time available during lives that were finite, requiring prioritizations of learning general principles that could be broadly applied instead of memorizations of specific facts that had utilities limited to particular contexts that were rarely encountered, justifying investments of time necessary for memorizations that were cognitively costly because memory capacities were limited, requiring careful selections about which information deserved to be permanently retained instead of being forgotten, freeing spaces for new information that was continuously encountered through experiences that accumulated throughout lives that were processes of continuous learning, where knowledge was constantly updated through incorporations of new information that modified existing understandings through accommodations that restructured cognitive schemas, instead of simply assimilating new information into existing structures that remained unchanged when new information was compatible with prior knowledge, but that needed to be modified when new information contradicted expectations based on current theories that were then revised to accommodate discrepant evidence that could not be ignored when sufficiently salient, and especially when replicated through multiple independent observations that increased confidence that phenomena were real instead of being artifacts of measurement errors or random fluctuations that were always possible when dealing with empirical data that were inherently noisy due to influences of multiple variables that were not perfectly controlled, even in carefully designed experiments that attempted to isolate effects of variables of interest, manipulating these systematically while keeping other variables constant through randomizations or through matching, that ensured that compared groups were equivalent in all relevant characteristics except for the manipulated variable, which was then responsible for observed differences in dependent variables that were measured through validated instruments that were reliable, producing consistent results when applied repeatedly to the same objects that did not change between measurements. Assuming stabilities of characteristics being measured, which was a reasonable assumption for many variables, but which was violated when characteristics were unstable, varying across times or across contexts, requiring repeated measurements on multiple occasions to capture temporal variabilities that were important for understandings of dynamics of phenomena that were not static, but that evolved over time through processes of developments or degradations that were interesting theoretically and mainly practically, when objectives were predictions of future states based on knowledge of current states and of laws that govern transitions between states that were described through mathematical models that abstracted essential aspects of real processes, ignoring details that were irrelevant for phenomena of interest, that were focuses of scientific investigations motivated by intellectual curiosities about how Worlds worked and mainly by desires to control natural processes, manipulating initial conditions or parameters that influenced trajectories of systems through state spaces that were characterized through dimensions corresponding to variables that were relevant for complete descriptions. Of systems that were objects of modelings, that were simplifications of realities that were inevitably more complex than any model that tried to capture essential characteristics, ignoring details that were not crucial for particular purposes that guided constructions of models that were conceptual tools, facilitating reasoning about complex phenomena that were difficult to comprehend intuitively, without aids of symbolic representations that externalized thoughts, allowing manipulations through formal rules that guaranteed validities of inferences. When rules were applied correctly to premises that were true, ensuring that conclusions were also true through logical deductions that were distinct from inductions that were less reliable, because they generalized from particular instances to general principles. That could be falsified through observations of contradictory instances that demonstrated that generalizations were excessively broad, needing to be qualified through specifications of conditions under which they were valid, limiting scopes of applicabilities of principles that were universally valid only within specific domains that were defined through assumptions that were often implicit rather than explicitly articulated, creating possibilities of misunderstandings when people applied principles outside domains where they were valid, committing categorical errors that were common when analogical reasonings were extended excessively, based on superficial similarities that masked fundamental differences that made analogies misleading rather than illuminating, which was the original intention of using analogies that were useful pedagogical tools when they were appropriate, but that could be harmful when they were misleading, leading to incorrect conclusions, based on false parallelisms that were not sustained when examined. Critically revealing disanalogies that were more important than superficial analogies that had initially motivated comparisons that were abandoned, when more careful analyses revealed limitations of approximations that were useful as first approximations, but that needed to be refined through more detailed examinations that revealed complexities that had been ignored in initial treatments, that were too simplified to capture nuances that were important for adequate understandings of phenomena, that were objects of studies that were conducted through rigorous methodologies, that were developed through accumulated experiences of scientific communities that had learned through errors they had committed, progressively improving practices through critical reflections on failures that had revealed limitations of previous approaches, that were replaced by improved approaches that were eventually also replaced through continuous processes of refinements that characterized scientific progress that were cumulative, building upon foundations established by predecessors who had made contributions that were recognized through of citations that properly attributed credit to original discoverers, who deserved recognition for work they had done advancing knowledge that benefited not only contemporaries but mainly future generations who inherited accumulated knowledge that was a resource freely shared through publications that were made available in libraries or increasingly online through the internet, that democratized access to information that was previously restricted to elites who had privileges to access university libraries or to buy books that were expensive, limiting diffusion of knowledge that was now widely available through digital technologies that radically transformed informational landscapes, creating opportunities but also challenges related to information overloads that were overwhelming when people were exposed to enormous quantities of content that were impossible to process, completely requiring filtering strategies that selected manageable subsets of information based on relevance to particular objectives that guided searches through oceans of data, using search tools that were sophisticated algorithms ranking results based on estimates of relevance that were derived from multiple signals, including popularity, measured through links that were interpreted as votes conferring authority to pages that were extensively cited by other pages that were also authoritative, creating hierarchies of credibility that were exploited by search engines that prioritized reliable sources over dubious sources that were relegated to lower positions in rankings that determined visibility because users rarely examined results beyond first pages that contained results that algorithms judged to be most relevant based on queries that were interpreted through natural language processing, that attempted to understand user intentions that were expressed through keywords that were sometimes ambiguous, requiring disambiguation through context analysis that informed interpretations of queries that were then executed against indices that were data structures optimized for rapid retrieval of documents, that were relevant to search terms that were specified through interfaces that were designed to be intuitive, minimizing usage barriers through simplicity that hid underlying complexities, that were managed by systems that were continuously improved through user feedback that was collected through multiple channels, including clicks that revealed implicit preferences through behaviors that complemented explicit feedback that was provided through ratings that users submitted when requested, but that were rare because most users did not invest effort to provide feedback, unless experiences were exceptionally good or bad. Motivating communications of satisfaction or dissatisfaction that were valuable to developers who used information to improve products through iterations that incorporated learnings from previous versions that had been tested with real users who provided insights that were not apparent during internal development, that was conducted by engineers who were not necessarily representative of typical users who had different backgrounds and skills requiring user testing to identify usability issues that were difficult to anticipate without direct observations of how products were used in natural contexts that differed from laboratory contexts where initial testing was conducted under controlled conditions that did not capture the variability of real situations, that introduced challenges that were not foreseen during design phases that were based on assumptions about user behaviors that were sometimes incorrect, revealing gaps between designers' mental models and usage realities that were discovered through testing, that was essential for developing products that were successful in markets, that were competitive, requiring differentiation. Through innovations that added value that was recognized by customers who were willing to pay premiums for features that improved experiences sufficiently to justify additional costs, that were calculated through value analysis that compared benefits with costs, deciding if products were worthy of investments that were always risky, because success was not guaranteed in markets that were unpredictable, depending on multiple factors, including timing that was critical, because products needed to be launched at the right moments when demand was high. But before competitors entered markets that we are sometimes saturated with similar offerings that made differentiations difficult when products were commoditized, competing mainly on prices that were compressed through competitions that benefited consumers, but harmed producers who had difficulties maintaining profitabilities when margins were squeezed. Requiring operational efficiencies that minimized costs through process optimizations or through economies of scale that were achieved through production expansions that were viable only when demands were sufficient to absorb increased volumes that were risky when demands were uncertain because excess inventories were costly, requiring storage, and mainly representing immobilized capital that could be alternatively invested in opportunities that were lost when resources were allocated to inventories that were not sold quickly, resulting in losses when products became obsolete or when they needed to be liquidated with discounts that were necessary to free up space, and mainly to partially recover investments that had been made in productions that had not generated expected returns due to errors in demand forecasts that were inherently difficult to make with precision, because consumer behaviors were influenced by multiple factors, including economic conditions that affected available incomes and mainly consumer confidence, that influenced dispositions to spend rather than save when the future was uncertain, motivating precautions that reduced consumption, adversely affecting businesses that depended on consumer spending, that were the majority of economies in developed countries, where consumption represented approximately 70% of gross domestic products, that were aggregate indicators of economic activities that were monitored by governments that tried to stabilize economies through fiscal and monetary policies, that manipulated government spending and mainly interest rates that influenced borrowing costs, affecting investments and consumption that were sensitive to interest rates, that were determined by central banks that adjusted policies based on assessments of economic conditions that were inferred from multiple indicators, including inflation and unemployment, that were objectives that frequently conflicted, because reductions in unemployment through stimulus could cause inflation when economies operated near maximum capacities, that were limited by availabilities of labor and capital, that were scarce resources that needed to be allocated efficiently through markets that coordinated supply and demand, through price systems that signaled relative scarcities, guiding decisions of producers and consumers that responded to incentives that were created by profits and utilities that were maximized through choices that were rational based on available information that was always incomplete, but sufficient for decisions that were satisfactory rather than optimal, because optimizations required information and computational capacities that were unrealistically high for humans who used heuristics, simplifying decisions through cognitive shortcuts that worked reasonably well in most cases but occasionally resulted in systematic errors that were cognitive biases that were studied by psychologists who documented multiple forms of deviations from rationalities that were normative, defining how decisions should be made ideally, rather than how they were actually made by people who had cognitive limitations that were recognized through concepts of bounded rationalities that contrasted with perfect rationalities, assumed in traditional economic models that were unrealistic but useful as approximations that provided insights into aggregate behaviors that were relatively predictable, despite unpredictabilities of individual behaviors that were heterogeneous, reflecting differences in preferences and circumstances that varied widely across populations that were diverse in demographic and socioeconomic characteristics that significantly influenced behaviors through material constraints, and mainly through cultural norms that shaped values and beliefs that were internalized through socializations. In particular, communities that were contexts forming identities that were constructed through interactions with other people who recognized or rejected performances of identities that were socially validated, when they were considered authentic rather than inauthentic, which were perceived as insincere performances trying to impress audiences rather than genuinely expressing characteristics that were valued because they were consistent with values that were centrist self. Concepts that were maintained through selectivity of memories that preserved information consistent with self. Images while forgetting or reinterpreting inconsistent information that threatened self. Esteem that was protected through defensive mechanisms that operated unconsciously distorting perceptions and memories in ways that favored egos through attributions that credited successes to talents, while blaming failures on circumstances that were conveniently external when they were beneficial for preservations of self. Esteem, but that were internal when they were necessary to maintain controls that were important for feelings of efficacy, that motivated efforts that were invested in pursuit of goals that were valued because they were intrinsically satisfying, or because they were instrumentally valuable, as means to ends that were ultimately desired for reasons that were sometimes difficult to articulate clearly, because they were based on intuitions or emotions that preceded rationalizations that were constructed afterward to justify decisions that had been made based on feelings rather than rational analyses that were normative ideals but that were rarely followed in practice, where decisions were often based on combinations of reasons and emotions that were integrated through processes that were not fully conscious but that worked reasonably well, allowing navigation through lives that were sufficiently satisfactory for most people who were not perfectly happy but who were also not miserable, finding balances between challenges and abilities that were characteristics of flow, experiences that were moments when people were completely absorbed in activities that were intrinsically motivating because they were sufficiently challenging to be interesting, but not excessively difficult to be frustrating, creating optimal mental states that were associated with subjective well-being that were goals that everyone pursued through diverse paths, reflecting pluralities of conceptions of good lives that were equally valid rather than there being universal hierarchies of values that should be accepted by everyone regardless of particular circumstances that were relevant to evaluations of options that were appropriate for specific individuals with unique histories and with life, projects that were personally meaningful even when they were not understood or approved by other people who had different values, but who needed to respect autonomies that were fundamental rights, allowing free choices within limits that were imposed by considerations about the well-being of other people who also had rights that needed to be respected, avoiding harms that were prohibited by basic moral principles that were shared across cultures, despite differences in details that varied, reflecting historical and environmental particularities that had shaped developments of moral traditions that were transmitted across generations through educations that socialized children into norms that were internalized through identifications with role models that exemplified virtues that were admired and mostly that were rewarded through social approvals that motivated conformities that were necessary for maintenance of social orders, that depended on cooperations that were facilitated through trusts, that were foundations of relationships that allowed vulnerabilities that were necessary for intimacies that were sources of deep emotional satisfactions that were essential for well-being, that were objectives that everyone pursued through lives that were unique journeys, sharing some universal characteristics, but differing in details that made each life singular and ultimately valuable, because it was unique, expressing individualities that were celebrated in modern cultures that valued diversities instead of conformities that were imposed in traditional societies. Did you like Marina's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll wait for you.